Like and subscribe right now, or else this will be in your bed tonight. r/AskReddit by Planet Reddit. What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out. He has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally we are supposed to stay inside the glass shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help while calling the police EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom and was wanted for rape and murder in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again. Kudos to the slugger that hit him. Plot twist. It was the 6-year-old. Damn girl deserves medal. The Lake Nyas disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. My science teacher in high school was in the Peace Corps and one of the first people to come across this village after it happened. He said it was so eerie because all the flies and mosquitoes had died and it was so silent. All the flies and mosquitoes had died. This scares me far more than the death of the people and livestock, because no matter where you go, you always expect for at least one fly or mosquito to be there, but to find even those things dead, my god. Hey, I mean I wouldn't be complaining about the mosquitoes, mostly because I'd be dead too, but that's beside the point. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Edited to add, I was in a rush when I wrote this, so you should definitely read more into the story. It's crazy. From the horrific act itself, to the court proceedings, to the fact that he hardly served any time. What really upsets me most about this is that Singleton was released from jail for good behavior and went on to murder a different woman a few years later, Roxanne Hayes. I think in these scenarios we can safely say that if you can rape someone, chop their ducking arms off and leave them to die, you aren't ever safe to be released. Well, he hasn't chopped any arms off or raped anyone in the last 2 years while in jail, so he is pretty much good to be released early. What the duck were they actually thinking? John List killed his whole family, wife, mother, daughter and 2 sons. He meticulously planned the whole thing, cancelling all delivery services, excusing the kids from school, and even turned the air conditioning as low as possible to preserve the bodies for as long as possible. After he killed them all, he placed the bodies in sleeping bags and lined them up. He then wrote a letter to his pastor explaining why he had to kill them. He then leaves and isn't heard from again. 18 years later he's remarried and doing the same job as before, but this time he doesn't have any children. He's finally arrested after a tip was given to the FBI. Crazy thing is that because he planned it so well, the bodies weren't discovered until a month after the murders, so he had a huge head start and essentially started a new life in the same career and was heavily involved in a new church down in Virginia. Took 18 years to capture him. What did the letter say that he left? He pretty much explained that he killed his family to ensure their entry into heaven because he was worried they were straying from their faith. So in a way, he thought he was saving their souls. Killers like that are the scariest. He thought he had a noble reason, but in reality he was crazy. One of my friends had someone following her home, hiding in the bushes so they couldn't be seen. She booked it to her house, got inside, and he was watching the house from the outside. She called the cops. They come along quietly and got the jump on him. He had condoms, handcuffs, and a knife. When they got his DNA, it turned out that he was linked to a half dozen rapes in the area. She credits her regimen of running sprints to outrunning him that night and firmly believes she would have been raped if she couldn't outrun him then. Rule number 1. Cardio. Rule number 2. Double tap. Rule number 3. Beware of bathrooms. In my town in the early 90s there was a notorious killer that had all of BC, Canada on watch. My wife's mother years and years before I knew them had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work. Arborist. She was in her laundry room when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was friends with her husband and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently he told him he could just walk in, which she knew was bullshit. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left she called the police, but he was long gone by the time they got here. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught. His mugshot put on TV and it was the guy in her house. Edit. The guy's name was Terry Driver. Here's a link to his wiki. My family has a similar story and I'm pretty sure some of you serial killer buffs out there might figure out who it is before the reveal because their story is pretty unique. When my parents were in college they went on a trip down to Florida. They had met through mutual friends and were down there together but hadn't gone on a date yet. My dad and one of his friends were planning to meet my mom and some of her friends at a hotel, but being the carefree college guys they were, they lost track of time and realized it was impossible to get to the hotel on time by walking. They decided the best solution to their problem was to hitchhike, and a car with 2 women picked him up. Everything seemed fine until the driver asked them if it was okay to stop for gas. My dad and his friend agreed it was no problem since they were making good time, and she drove into a gas station. She then pumped her car full of gas before hopping back in and flooring it, basically stealing the gas with 2 hitchhikers in the back. My dad and his friend were beginning to freak out when she pulled a gun from under her seat and asked, "Are we gonna have a problem?" or something like that. My dad and his friend shook their heads vehemently because what else do you do in that situation? The only reason my dad thinks she didn't straight up kill them was because they were super polite and respectful to her, and her victims were usually scumbag guys trying to take advantage of her. Too long didn't read. Eileen Wernos is the reason my dad got to his first date with mom on time. Edit. Spelling. OMG, this is the craziest How I Met Your Mother story I ever heard. Holy shit, this is horrifying. What a smart woman. An acquaintance of mine sent his son to triathlon camp in Texas. A week later, his son came back from camp. The next day, the son was complaining of a headache. 4 days later, he was dead. Healthy, happy, fit 12-year-old 1 week, dead the next. Turns out the lake had Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. Nothing scares me as irrationally as already being dead and waiting for your body to catch on. Link for those interested. Naegleria is terrifying to me. You can get it just from getting water up your nose swimming in a lake, or, I've heard but I'm too lazy to check, there have been people who got it from using a neti pot. Yep, the amoeba needs to come into contact with the top of your nose, so you have to snort the water. Or, if you happen to live in Louisiana in 2013, they weren't using enough choline in the water supply, so people using neti pots with tap water were exposed. The good news is that the brain eaters really like specific conditions. They like very warm, 80°F plus, stagnant water with 0 salt or chlorine. So even a little bit of chlorine or bromine is enough to protect yourself. In the US, only lakes in the South, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, etc. meet those conditions, and humans don't want to spend a lot of time in that water since it's usually pretty gross. Even then, you still have to get the water up your nose. Water skiing or jet skiing are the 2 common causes. Edit. Also cases in MN and AZ. Interestingly, there was a guy here who didn't ask me anything about a treatment. You just have to move quickly, because once a person loses their sense of smell, it's already over, because the amoebae have eaten your olfactory bulb, the part of your brain responsible for smelling. Then it continues eating, and eventually ends up at your brainstem, which controls things like breathing and heart rate. I'm now testing my smelling abilities just to convince myself I don't have this. I mean, I don't have any of the other symptoms either, but my irrational brain just has to confirm that I really don't have it. Join our community Discord, link in description. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other three sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. Two of them died on impact and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that two doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after to be a warning to all. That's terrifying. I missed a situation like this years ago. Was hanging out with a buddy at the bars and we leave to go back to his place for some smoke and video games. His roommate comes home from work. He was a bartender and tells us he's heading out to the bars and asks if we want to go. He'll drive. We go back and forth but eventually decide to stay in. Turns out, the buddy had been drinking heavily at work, but we couldn't tell. He ended up flipping his Jeep off of an overpass and dropping 20+ feet. The entire back of his Jeep, where I would have been sitting, was crushed into the back of the front seat. The roll bar was smashed into the passenger side. Buddy ended up getting some serious brain injuries and spent the next few years learning how to walk and talk again. He's still pretty off and much different than he used to be. My other buddy and I came very close to a similar or worse fate. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up. Maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with a carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. This sounds exactly like the story of There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane. Another real-life event where a woman drove a van full of children down the wrong way while being high on some drug before eventually hitting another car and killing herself and the kids. Really odd similarities between Judy Kirby and Diane Schuller's cases. Edit. Had forgotten the details of Diane's case, but she had apparently been horribly drunk. Empty handle of vodka found at the scene plus blood alcohol content twice the legal limit in autopsy, and had tested positive for THC in her system. How do people do shit like that? My grandfather was an engineer/architect for US Steel through the early 70s. One day a co-worker who was getting divorced brought his young son and young daughter for a tour of a steel mill. Proceeded to bypass the admittedly lax security of the 60s. Picks up his kids and jumps, with them, into some molten steel. People that kill kids are horrifying, but parents who kill their own kids, Jesus. Edit. My grandfather never shared any more of the story than what I described. Didn't think he would have, but checked with my dad, who also asked what happened. Grandfather said they got rid of didn't use that batch of steel, whatever that means. Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs I looked and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door and pushed a bunch of boxes against it and then went and hid in my closet. For months I didn't tell my family because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost and didn't think anyone would believe me. Edit. Whoa, this blew up way more than I expected. I'm doing my best to respond to comments questions. Sorry if I end up missing yours. Home invasion is seriously one of the scariest things that can happen to a person. The home is like a final refuge from the world and to have it violated like that is so unnerving. My wife called me while I was at Walmart one day. She had a broken ankle and had just had surgery on a hernia. Her mobility was like 5 out of 100. And of course someone tried to break in. Her saving grace was yelling through the door that she was on the phone with cops. Really, with me? I'm on the way home. And I passed the guy, to the exact description my wife gave me and the cops. I swerved his ass off his bike, hopped out the car and sat my fat ass on top of him until the cops got to where I was. Guy had a gun, rope, lock tools. It cold been bad. Luckily though he ran, and with even more luck we crossed paths. He cold went anywhere where he left my yard, but he came straight towards the Walmart I was leaving that was about 3 minutes away. Edit. I've had a few DMs questioning the authenticity of this. I can't prove it other than you/Inda said lobotomy was in the car with me when it went down. My brother's ex-GF had 2 older sisters. They died before she was born. One day they decided to play hide and seek or something. So anyway, they both climbed inside a chest and accidentally locked themselves in. They suffocated. That is terrifying. It's particularly terrifying to me because I remember when I was younger something similar almost happened to me and my cousin. She had a daybed and we decided to get behind it and push it against the wall so we could play and nap in the dark. It got unbearably hot and we realized we couldn't breathe after about 30 minutes. If it wouldn't have also gotten so hot from our fear/body heat lack of oxygen, we might have actually suffocated because we were getting lightheaded. It was scary, but eventually we pulled the bed away from the wall. I have no idea how that could happen on carpet. Bizarre freak accidents are just so strange. I'm truly sorry for your brother's ex-GF. Edit. The bedIamgood.com link. Tough to pick just one because there is true evil in humanity out there. Stuff like the Blood Eagle ritual is pretty awful. But in terms of really scary, probably stuff that just kind of happens on accident. Like the story of Kyle Blush. Just awful. He was in a minivan that has one of those back seats that you can push backward to lay flat in the trunk for extra storage space. He went to grab something in the trunk, leaning over the seat, and it tipped backward and pinned him, upside down, against the back of the car in a position such that he couldn't get himself out. He called the police twice. The second time he called and gave them a very clear description of the car. Plush called 911 again at around 3:35 p.m. Police said this time he provided a description of the vehicle as he desperately pleaded for help but couldn't hear the dispatcher. Isaac said the information didn't get relayed to officers at the scene. This is not a joke, the teen said over 911. I'm almost dead. He asked the dispatcher to tell my mom I'll love her if I die. ABC13.com link. I still don't get why the hell they couldn't have gotten to him in time. His parents have filed a lawsuit over this. Because honestly, there's no reason that child should have died as long as he was on that phone with 911. I don't get it either and I'm glad they filed a lawsuit. The fact that the 911 dispatcher didn't relay info about the vehicle to the police that were on scene is what killed that boy. They were there, searching, and he gave them a description of the vehicle as he was dying. For whatever reason, she claimed her computer was frozen. But then WTF did she take the call? The dispatcher opted not to tell the police because I guess the kid wasn't actually answering questions. Which makes sense because it was an emergency situation where the kid couldn't hear his phone. While looking for articles I saw one saying that the dispatcher had been put on leave but was allowed to return to work. Absolutely disgraceful. God help anyone else who calls and ends up getting her because apparently she gets to choose what she does or does not relay to the police. I remember this story and it made me so unbelievably angry at the dispatcher. This death was completely avoidable if the dispatcher had done her job. Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived, he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would have sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body is still in the cave. Didn't they almost get him out? But then one of the pulleys snapped and he got trapped even worse? That's my personal nightmare. Yes, this story is why I'm never going spelunking. One of many stories. In general, I wouldn't say I'm claustrophobic, but fuuuuuck caves. There was a woman who worked in a science lab who spilled 2 drops of organic mercury on the back of her gloved hand. Those 2 drops destroyed her entire nervous system and brain. YouTube.com/link. The mercury story always scares the crap out of me because I used to work in a lab and we had a compound that could go through gloves. I read the material safety data sheet before I handled the compound, something you're always supposed to do, and it warned that proper personal protective equipment should be worn and that the compound was a horrible, toxic carcinogen. Not knowing that it could go through gloves, none of us did. We began handling it. I got some on my palm and continued working. It only took like 5 seconds for my hand to feel warm and strange. So I removed the glove and there was a large splotch on my left palm. I immediately went to wash up, scared for my life. It went through my skin immediately, and it also targeted the nervous system. But I ended up being fine due to minimal exposure. I can't remember what compound it was now because it was so long ago, but it had a lot of P words. Scary stuff. There's nothing scarier than working in a lab and knowing you're doing everything right just to have it all go wrong. I can't even get my noodles to my mouth without dripping some on myself. Think I'll pass on this career path. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for 3 videos a day.